Ladies and gentlemen, young and old, this may seem an unusual procedure, speaking to you before the picture begins, but we have an unusual subject.
Last month, we talked about New York City in May of 1978. This month, we look at New York City in June 1978. Don't get used to this pattern.
Well, if you're wondering what's happened, so am I. Actually, the computer that we have running our news from time to time took off and went wild. So what we're going to do is start over from the top.
Hi everybody, Brendan here with another edition of This Month in Punk Rock History. Remember when we said the John Peel Show was the Holy Grail and An American Tour was the Ark of the Covenant? If it wasn't clear then, what I meant was that these events propelled the groups to stardom. Sort of. The Damned, The Clash, and the Sex Pistols, despite breaking up, benefited from their respective Peel appearances and American tours. But when Anarcho-Punk pioneers Crass were played by Peel, nothing happened. And when they went to New York, no one noticed. It's June 2023, and this month in punk rock history, we look at Crass's only American gigs. But first I want to take a second and offer a quick shout out to my host, Sweet Jimmy Network.
I need your help. I am on the cusp of 500 subscribers, setting my sights on 1,000 by year's end.
And what is the Sweet Jimmy Network, you may ask?
The Sweet Jimmy Network is an unconventional journey into the bizarre, the forgotten, and the untold. Check out This Month in Punk Rock History, Tales from the Thrift, and coming soon, Sounds Unknown, all about underground and indie music.
Our intention was not to create a story, but to be worthy of the divinely inspired story created 3,000 years ago.
Crass formed in 1977 when young Steve Ignorant appeared on the doorstep of old Penny Rambo at Dial House in Essex, England.
Hi, Mr. Wilson.
Oh, hello, Dennis.
I've been ringing your bell.
Ignorant, having just been dared by Joe Strummer to start his own band, told old Penny about punk rock. Penny dug the new sound and offered to be Steve's drummer. Next thing you know,
ladies and gentlemen, it's Christ!
For some context, Crass was not a typical band. They weren't really a typical anything. Sure, they had a drummer, a bassist, 2 guitar players, and eventually 3 singers, but they were really a loosely tied artist collective centered around Dial House's open house model. Other members of the group included filmmaker Mick Duffield and visual artist G. Vaucher, the star of today's show. Vaucher and Rambo met in Southeast Essex Technical College and School of Art, where they were inspired by an Ingrid Bergman movie to turn the derelict Dial House property to an anarcho-pacifist open house in 1967. They later founded the avant-garde jazz/performance art group Exit with sound engineer John Loder. George Berger describes Exit as an extension of Dial House's open policy. To call the lineup fluid, he says, would be an understatement. People were free to come and go as they pleased. As Exit evolved from a sonic experience to performance art, future Crass bassist Pete Wright joined the fold, along with the aforementioned Mick Duffield. Exit's big claim to fame was the International Carnival of Experimental Sound, or ISIS, festival at London's Roundhouse in 1972. Not long after, though, the group had dissolved. During this time, artist Dave King, who designed the now ubiquitous Crass logo, abandoned his commercial design career and moved into Dial House full-time. As King moved in, Vaucher moved out. She moved to New York to pursue a career as a freelance political artist with pieces published in New York Magazine and the New York Times, among others. She arrived in the city just in time for the American punk rock explosion in New York, and soon became a regular at CBGB. Intending to stay for only a few months, she ended up staying for a few years. Meanwhile, despite the communal living of Dial House, King became increasingly lonely as Rambo fought off a deep depression with booze. So in 1977, King flew to New York to visit Vaucher. He intended to stay for only a few weeks, but ended up staying for a few months. Rambo was alone in Dial House. This is when 18-year-old Steve Ignorant told his 34-year-old friend about the Clash gig and his intent to start a punk band. The duo is described by Berger as, quote, Steve shouting and ranting whilst Penny Rambo played along on drums. This new band was called Stormtrooper. Word soon got out through the underground grapevine that a new punk band was forming out of Dial House, and they were offered a gig at a free street festival in a courtyard behind a hippie squat. Out of nowhere, a, quote, funny balding little guy with a beard arrives to visit Rambo at Dial House, and as luck would have it, he knew how to play guitar. And so Steve Herman became the third Stormtrooper, and Pete Wright, who had been using the Dial House music room for his folk duo Friends of Wensleydale Jasper, was added on bass. A few weeks later, they played their first gig. Now, Herman never really meshed with the rest of the Dial House gang and was soon sacked and replaced by Phil Free, whose brother was in the aforementioned Exit. The early core lineup was complete, and the gigging began. First, the university circuit, and then the infamous Band from the Roxy show. These were followed by a series of gigs with the UK Subs at the White Lion in Putney and a Rock Against Racism show at the Action Space before Vulture set them up in New York. Remember earlier when I said Crass came to New York and no one noticed? Well, that's partly because Vulture, quote, avoided booking the obvious. I said, I'm not going to book CBGBs or Maxes. I booked the Puerto Rican Club and the Polish Club. When they first arrived at JFK, the black-clad group was met with praise and admiration from an American GI who told them they had, quote, guts and balls. The group was less than impressed. Ignorant, who had never left the UK,
I hadn't even been to the Isle of Wight before,
was enamored.
I thought it was fantastic. You could get amyl nitrate on the street corner and smoke grass in people's houses. There were these places called transvestite bars, where women that were actually men but looked like women. The beer was cheap, the food was great, and no one thought you were weird if you were vegetarian.
But even in New York, Crass's hardline appearance and no-holds-barred performance was not necessarily met with open arms. In a pamphlet written to accompany their Feeding of the 5000 album, the band recalls one of their American shows, a benefit for gypsy buskers, perhaps at the Polish Club. Power was cut 2 minutes into their set. From the darkness, they were barraged by shouts of, "Fascist bastard!" The set resumed, but the crowd remained cold. We weren't paid and we weren't thanked, the pamphlet says. But as they packed their van and began their departure, they were stopped by a tap on the window. "You boys were fucking great," the inebriated and unhoused man said as he unzipped his fly and began urinating against the van. Fucking great.
Again.
You dirty fucker.
What a clever boy.
What a fucking rotter.
Well, that's...
The other performance discussed in the pamphlet took place on June 30th, 1978, at a complex on 9 2nd Avenue near Houston. The 1922 building's original occupants, the Church of All Nations, had moved to St. Mark's Place in the early 70s, and the city quickly blocked up the windows of the old building and declared it abandoned. By 1975, a group known as Cultural Understanding and Neighborhood Development Organization, or QANDO, had seized the building, effectively turning it into a squat. They replaced the block with glass and began hosting events in other community organizations, and soon forced the city to offer a legitimate lease. Now, details about the New York tour are scarce, but it may have been at this show where Crass first witnessed an overt act of racism, when the reggae group Wild Bunch, who opened the show, was denied elevator access needed to move their equipment into the stage area. Vulture recalls the anarchists saying, "Fuck you, they're coming in the lift with us." Preceding Crass that night was No Wave act James Chance and the Contortions. You may remember them from last month's Johnny Blitz benefit story. Well, like I told you last month, Chance's shtick was to literally attack his audience. Neither the crowd nor Crass were impressed. Steve Ignorant called Chance, quote, a typical American shithead. Not surprisingly, Chance's performance art was met with hostility and he was swarmed by a group of 5 men. Knives were pulled, blood was spilled, cops showed up, but the show somehow still went on. Crass opened their set with a presumably sarcastic moment of silence for the man whose blood was shed. And although Chance was not seriously harmed, the incident led to the cancellation of the planned second Quando gig the following day. It also cost Crass the money they were counting on as return fare. According to official listings, Crass was at least booked for 5 gigs in New York, but documentation is scarce, so it's not clear how many were actually played and where. Verifying the mere existence of some of these places is a task in and of itself. So, as always, if you know more than I do, please enlighten me in the comments section. Eve Libertine, who was not yet a member of the band, remembers a cool New York reception and a hot New York summer. She thought the American crowds were, quote, more arty than England. Pete Wright remembers thinking their presence in the US was irrelevant, but still calls the mini-tour, quote, landmark in terms of the band getting serious. Likewise, Rambo recognized the power of punk and was determined to reclaim this power. In the very beginning, when it was just ignorant ranting to the beats of Rambo's drum, they didn't take themselves seriously. But upon conclusion of their Lower Manhattan tour, Rambo drew a line in the sand.
Those who stay, cross over the line.
He declared, according to David Solomon's, quote, either they were to become a serious proposition or he was no longer interested in carrying on with the band. For Vaucher, it was a reminder of the power and purpose of art. She had reluctantly acquiesced to an editor's demand to tone down an illustration of 2 men kissing in a tranquil Central Park following an attack by a gang of anti-gay youth on anyone they perceived to be gay. Unable to forgive herself for bowing to corporate pressure, she resigned and left New York for Dial House to become a full-time member of Crass. Eve Libertine and Joy DeVive also joined, offering a feminine balance to the group. The classic lineup that remained stable through the planned breakup of 1984 was complete, and the group began to find their footing as activists and as musicians. So aside from some culture shock and a confrontation with a racist elevator operator, the gig with Chance was about the extent of the controversy. There was no food fight, no AWOL bassist, and no fans were attacked with guitars. Crass's presence in New York in June of 1978 left almost no mark on the new world, but for the band, it marked a turning point. They'd had their fun, but now there was work to do. Speaking of work, this video took a lot of work. Thanks to David Worth for the Crass cartoon, and thanks to Natty T for the train video. Links to their respective sites are in the description. Today's episode is brought to you by The Letter A. This Month in Punk Rock History is written and narrated by me, Brendan McCabe. My producer is Sweet Jimmy Cook. We're taking July off so we can go to a few shows and maybe relax for a bit. So join me in August when I do my best French accent as we look at the first ever European Punk Festival. In the meantime, don't forget to check out my half-assed attempt to recount the day-by-day events of the scene with Today in Punk Rock History via tiprh.start.page. For This Month in Punk Rock History, I'm Brendan McCabe.
So let it be written, so let it be done.
So speaks Ramesses the First.